April 8th, 1864. 150 years ago, 12,000 Union soldiers from the Army of the Gulf, under General Nathaniel Banks, fought and lost a decisive engagement near Mansfield, Louisiana. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Historical Gamer, and in this video that you're watching I'm playing Scourge of War Gettysburg, a video game created by Norbsoft Dev and published by Matrix and Slytherin Games. The game is actually running a mod right now about the Red River campaign, so while the stock game focuses on the Battle of Gettysburg and the expansions add on the battles of Antietam, Chancellorsville, Brandy Station, and the hypothetical engagement at Pipes Creek, this is actually a mod called the Red River campaign mod, and the mod allows you to play several key battles from the Red River campaign of 1864 within the Scourge of War Gettysburg game. It's a free mod put together by the developers of the game, and that's what you're seeing right here. That's what I'm playing through in this video. So this is going to be the first in a series of videos which I'm going to do focusing on the Red River campaign, and despite the fact that I'm a few days late from putting this up on the actual 150th anniversary, I'm going to try and get the other videos out to match with the 150th anniversary of those battles. The obvious exception being the battle which was fought on April 9th, which will be the second part of this series. I hope you enjoy, and with that, let's get into a little bit about the battle. The Battle of Mansfield was the first major engagement of the Red River campaign, an offensive by the Union with the goal of taking the city of Shreveport, destroying the main Confederate Army in the Trans-Mississippi Department, and to confiscate as much as 100,000 bales of cotton in an attempt to help grind the Confederate economy to a halt. With the seizure of Vicksburg the previous summer, a successful campaign along the Red River in Louisiana would threaten to cut the state in two and further divide up an already split Confederacy, negating the usefulness of the remaining part of the state of Louisiana and firmly controlling it under the Union forces. New Orleans was already under Union control, as well as Baton Rouge, and as I just said, the entire length of the Mississippi was also under Union control. So taking Shreveport would have essentially ended Louisiana's usefulness as a Confederate state and helped to limit the Confederate economy in the West. The destruction of the Confederate Army of the Trans-Mississippi would also leave the other western states, such as Texas, severely exposed without any means of defense, and could have served a decisive blow, severely weakening the western half of the Confederacy, perhaps to a point of irrelevance, allowing Union forces to focus strictly on the eastern half of the Confederacy. However, it was not to be. General Banks, who had famously been defeated by General Jackson during his famous Valley campaign in 1862, and then again later that year at the Battle of Cedar Mountain during the Second Manassas campaign, was also defeated by General Jackson yet again, was on fine display. Jackson may have been dead by 1864, but General Banks's ability to lose, and lose spectacularly, was still solidly alive. General Banks was worse than most and better than very few on the field of battle, and yet perhaps this isn't entirely fair to a man whose real calling in life was certainly not the military. He was appointed the rank of general mainly because of his political connections. He was actually a congressman before the war, and as a result, he was able to parlay that political success into a military command. It was an easy way for General Lincoln to score points at home and appease voters, getting certain popular political figures commands in the army. Banks was certainly not the only one who saw his political importance rewarded with a military command, but he might have been among the worst. After his abject failure in the Red River campaign, General Banks would be removed from command and never again given command of troops on the field of battle. He was mustered out of the army after the end of the war in August of 1865, and despite his terrible military record, he was able again to rejoin Congress. After the war, when he rejoined Congress, he became the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and at times also headed up the Republican caucus. He played a key role in the Alaska Purchase, in which the United States would purchase a territory which would become the state of Alaska from the Russian Empire, and he was also one of the early advocates of Manifest Destiny, an idea that the United States should possess a land corridor from east to west to connect the United States on the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Banks also had significant financial success as well, Perhaps as a result of the Alaska Purchase, there was a large gratuity which was deposited into his bank by the Russian minister. Perhaps signs that he wasn't all that honest and forthright either as a politician, which, okay, that's not much of a shock, especially during the 1800s. So as you can see here, I'm getting my troops into position, and there you can see on the map here that the Confederate Army, which is in gray, kind of has a horseshoe type shape around the Union Army, which has more of an L-shaped position. The Battle of Mansfield, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail, saw the Confederate forces actually attack despite being outnumbered against the Union troops which were advancing along the Red River. At the start of the battle, the Confederate Army had about 5,000 men on the field to the Union Army's 6,000. By the end of the battle, there were about 12,000 Union troops on the field to the 14,000 Confederates. So briefly, my strategy, as I've kind of alluded to it, is the Confederate force occupy roughly a horseshoe kind of around the outer ring of the Union forces. The Union troops have about an L-shaped formation built along this road line. My intent is to commence a double envelopment on both flanks, using my starting position to allow that, and then also to move a strong force forward with some frontal attacks to push the Union back, hopefully flanking them on both sides and driving them down the road, as historically the Confederates were able to push them out of position and win this battle in decisive fashion. In some ways, it's a simple battle in that the Union has a thin, small line up the middle of this roadway here near Mansfield, and in other ways, it's typical of many engagements with the commander attempting a double envelopment. The double envelopment was a dreamed upon scenario in which commanders would be able to flank the enemy on both sides, and it was attempted by generals numerous times throughout the war, but very rarely was it ever pulled off successfully. I'm not sure if there ever was actually a successful double envelopment. If you do want to look up a historical example of what that can look like, and what most of the generals in the Civil War were trying to duplicate, would be the Carthaginian victories over the Romans under General Hannibal. Cannae, if that's how you pronounce it. That battle was a good example of a double envelopment, I believe, and it was kind of the recipe or the dreamed upon scenario for pretty much every commander on both sides of the battle. They were largely students of history, largely big scholars. Almost all of the officers, or many of the officers, not almost all, but many of the officers went to West Point, and I'm starting to ramble, so I'm going to stop it there. As you can see here, my cavalry is attempting to take out enemy artillery. We already forced one regiment to surrender. I'd like to get that other gun out of here now. These guns are going to be somewhat sitting ducks to these regiments of infantry, but at the very least, I've weakened their flank. I don't think I'm going to turn that straight part of the L, but at least put pressure there that'll allow me to have an easier time when attacking their front. That would be kind of my guess. Now, it is worth mentioning, you do see there's a lot of cavalry here, a lot of rangers, partisans. That was a fixture of the Western campaign battles, is that there was a high percentage of mounted troops, but not exactly in the heavy cavalry sort of way that you would see in Napoleonic or European battles. Much more irregular forces on horses and whatnot. Anyway, so you saw that a lot. You didn't see a whole lot of cavalry charges like I'm using them here. Again, cavalry was used more often for their mobility and scouting abilities and raiding abilities, and not very often would they be taking advantage of shock trooper type formations. The rifled musket, which was used in the Civil War, in many ways made the cavalry charge somewhat obsolete, as it pushed engagement ranges out and also somewhat invalidated many of the old European customs of fighting wars. But since the Europeans didn't really care about American tactics and viewed the Americans somewhat as rustics, despite the lessons of the Civil War and the limited occurrence of cavalry charges, the Europeans would continue to use those forces all the way up until the First World War. Anyway, as I said, starting to ramble a little bit, so let's rein ourselves in. We talked about General Nathaniel P. Banks, the commander of the Union force. What about the commander of the Confederate forces? Well, you can see him there on the bottom of the screen, General Richard Taylor. Who was he, and what was his history? General Richard Taylor might not have been more different than General Banks if he had tried. He was a student of Harvard and then Yale, where he graduated. He read many books on military and classical history. He was the son of General Zachary Taylor, who was famous during the Mexican-American War in fighting on the, I guess you could call it the Northern Front. It was on the Texas-Mexican border during the Mexican-American War, and while General Winfield Scott participated in the amphibious assault, which landed in the Yucatan, well, maybe not really Yucatan, but landed at Veracruz and drove on Mexico City. General Taylor's forces were on the northern end, advancing from north to south, and he became a war hero. Zachary Taylor ended up becoming the 12th President of the United States, and Richard Taylor was his son. He served as his father's military secretary during the war before needing to withdraw from the military because he contracted rheumatoid arthritis. Taylor did follow in Banks's footsteps in one regard. He became a state senator just before the war, and when the Civil War did erupt, General Braxton Bragg asked Taylor to assist him as a civilian in Pensacola, Florida. Bragg had known Taylor from before the war, and thought he was wise in the ways of military history, thought he might be able to assist him in organizing and training Confederate forces. Interestingly enough, Richard Taylor had actually been opposed to secession, but nonetheless he ended up fighting with the Confederacy and fighting for the Confederacy despite him opposing the secession and the break with the Union, or the United States. He was promoted to brigadier general early in the war, commanded a Louisiana brigade under General Richard Ewell during the Shenandoah Valley and during the 7 Days Campaign. So as he commanded a brigade under Ewell, he actually would have been fighting Banks. So in some regards, the Red River Campaign was a meeting of two foes who had met when they were ranked a little bit lower. Banks, I believe, was still a major general during the Shenandoah Valley Campaign when Jackson whipped him, but General Tyler was only a brigadier general in command of a brigade at the time. He served in numerous battles. He served in the Battle of First Bull Run during Jackson's Valley Campaign, as I said, the 7 Days battles. He then took quite a long time out. He would be involved in the siege of Port Hudson, where the Confederacy actually lost their last location along the Mississippi River. It wasn't their last port like Vicksburg was, but it was their last physical location. It was a fort on the Mississippi, happened shortly after the fall of Vicksburg. And he would end up commanding Confederate troops during the Red River Campaign. Taylor was a taskmaster and in some ways may have been similar to General McClellan. He was well liked by many people in charge, President Jefferson Davis and many of his contemporaries, and yet what he was most famously known for was his ability to train and recruit troops and organize troops effectively. The interesting thing is he wasn't given command of massive forces early on, despite being one of the youngest major generals in the Confederate Army, and perhaps is a symbol of what maybe a more effective General McClellan, or an effective use of General McClellan, would have been for the Union forces in contrast. That's not to say he was incompetent on the field of battle. As we would see in the Red River Campaign, he was probably more aggressive and willing to sacrifice troops than General McClellan was, although to his credit McClellan did see success on his own in smaller engagements. It's when he commanded the main forces, which General Taylor never did, that we saw McClellan's failures. But that being said, he was a taskmaster, an excellent organization commander, and a highly effective disciplinarian, popular with many of his contemporaries who came to know him. In fact, largely as a result of the Red River Campaign, he was promoted to lieutenant general despite command conflicts with his direct superior, General Kirby Smith, and by the end of the war was commanding what was left of the Army of the Tennessee, following General John Bell Hood's attacks and disastrous campaigns. He was actually the individual who surrendered the last main Confederate body in Alabama at the end of the war, and as I said, he was promoted to lieutenant general and commanded the remnants of the Army of Tennessee. Taylor was in many ways a military historian's perhaps dream of what you could become in a difficult situation. In that sense that he was a civilian soldier. He was not regular army, unlike most officers in the war. Unlike many other officers, he also wasn't a political appointment. He had connections, no doubt, but it wasn't his politics that got him involved. He was an avid military historian, if you will, and that served him well in the battlefield. Many of his contemporaries came to respect him and admire him and consider him a very capable and successful general, and indeed his own campaign records show that. In his independent campaign, the Red River Campaign was a smashing success for the Confederate force. He also had a relatively successful campaign on New Orleans, which he only had to withdraw because of the fall of Port Hudson in 1863 that left his rear exposed in his effort to relieve the city of Vicksburg by pulling Union troops. It didn't work, but he did nearly advance into the suburbs of New Orleans. All this on someone who basically does what a lot of us who probably are watching this video do and read a lot of history and are really fascinated by history, and all of a sudden they're thrust into the moment, and boy did he succeed. In many ways he's someone that I think amateur historians and professional historians as well, who are interested in military history, really, if they knew more about him, would admire him to a great degree. He actually wrote a memoir. After the war, he became involved in politics. He was opposed to Northern Reconstruction plans. He was also an author. He wrote his memoirs called Destruction and Reconstruction, which, granted, I don't have a lot of information on this. I don't like going by Wikipedia, but they do mention that it's one of the more mentioned works on the war. And it was published shortly before his death. He died in 1879, and it's just a really interesting fellow. Kind of the polar opposite of Banks, a non-military person just like him, with a storied military history, and also, unlike Banks, was incredibly successful. So that's a little profile on our two commanders here. As you can see here, the battle is fully gauged. I've taken away the trees here temporarily to get a better sense of what's going on. Quite a heavy engagement here. We've got some soldiers coming up on the line. Hopefully, I'm trying to gauge. Looks like we are pushing the Union back somewhat slowly, but we are doing it. We've got cavalry on the flanks, driving up the center. So we're pretty hotly engaged there. We got some cavalry charge going here. Hopefully that's successful to drive back the Union. But now that we've talked a little bit about the commanders of both armies, let's go ahead and talk about the Red River Campaign, how we got to this battle, and what actually historically took place. Because you can see here as I throw the trees back in and then take them away so you can see what's going on. We are heavily engaged. As I said, I'm using cavalry charges in a way that's not historically used. You don't have to use them this way. I just am impatient, and horses move faster. So maybe not terribly historically accurate, but it's my playstyle, so there you go. But anyway, so what about the Red River Campaign? And then I've given you a little bit of history about it, and obviously the results, and I've talked about the commanders. But how do we get here? How do we get to this battle, and how do we, you know, what was the result? And well, let's just go from there. Before we go there real quick, I just love shots like this, just panning back and forth, seeing lines of troops firing at each other, the smoke, the fields, it's an amazing sight to me, to watch these types of engagements kind of from this height. I can only imagine what it would have looked like in real life had these types of camera angles been available. It's just, I know I help out and I'm part of the Scourge of War team, but this is why is my love of this game and the way that it simulates, you know, battles. Obviously nothing's perfect. There's always things we want to improve upon and make better, but just this sort of sweeping panorama. And this is a small engagement by Scourge of War standards. You know, a couple of brigades fighting in an open field. You don't even get this kind of look of stuff in Total War, things break down way too quick, and it's just, it can't hope to model this type of fight and these sort of realistic interactions. I enjoy the Total War series, but just the game is... I'm sorry. Anyway, getting off topic. So, as I said, let's take a look at the Red River campaign, talk a little bit about it, talk about the beginning of the campaign, and then how we got to where we are here, and you know, how this battle unfolded, because this is a little bit longer of a scenario than I normally do, so we've got a little bit of time. I'm going to fast forward at certain parts, but definitely not right now when there's still a lot of fighting going on and a lot being done on the screen. So, as I said, let's get into the Red River campaign. What was it? What happened? And how did we get to this point? And then we'll carry over the rest of the campaign after this battle in future videos that cover those battles. So, Red River campaign, let's take a look. Union forces began gathering for the Red River campaign. The forces were made up of 20,000 men from New Orleans, about 15,000 men which headed south from Vicksburg after the recent victory there, and then a 7,000 man force advancing from Arkansas into northern Louisiana. As I previously said, the goal was Shreveport along the Red River. The campaign was designed to destroy parts of the southern economy, steal valuable cotton supplies which could then be resold in the north for a handsome profit and essentially pay for the expedition itself, and seize control of the remainder of Louisiana by taking the key city of Shreveport. Louisiana was already firmly in the Union grips on the eastern coast, with the Mississippi fully under the Union control. The city of Baton Rouge, as well as New Orleans, were both under Union control as well, and Shreveport was the main remaining city left under Confederate control. The attack would also make Confederate forces in the west somewhat distracted, and further isolate the Confederates who were already trapped to the west of the Mississippi. The campaign got off on the right foot, with Union troops seizing the Confederate fort of Fort DeRussy, which was located near the mouth of the Red River. The Red River is a tributary which flows into the Mississippi River, and the Union forces were using gunboats which came up the Mississippi and then traveled up the Red River. However, one interesting dilemma or problem that the Union forces faced as they got further and further up the river, and would be more relevant in their retreat, was the fact that the river was not terribly deep and posed a serious problem in the Union withdrawal. But that's more for later. The Union troops advanced, starting in March. As I said, they took Fort DeRussy, and were advancing somewhat unopposed up the Red River. The addition of the Union gunboats from the Mississippi River were a vital component to the Union advance. It made the Union forces very difficult to attack or deal with from a Confederate standpoint, because Union gunboats were able to lay down heavy supporting fire against any potential Confederate attack, which was a key component in the Union advancing quite a long way without any serious resistance. They took the Fort DeRussy. They then advanced into Alexandria, Louisiana, which fell to Union forces. While the Union troops were advancing along the river, a large body of troops were being transported on board the naval vessels up the river, but the larger portion of the Union force was actually being marched along the banks of the river. Easily exploitable early in the campaign, would prove fatal as the Union forces advanced. So initially Fort DeRussy fell with about 300 Confederate prisoners. Alexandria fell shortly thereafter. The Union continued their advance up the Red River and took Grand Encore, or passed by it. It was just a little bit north of Grand Encore, as the Union troops were beginning to close in on Shreveport, that the Army, the land portion, swung out west to pass, I believe, a more marshed or wooded area as they approached Shreveport, where the Red River split. and the army was essentially swinging west before it would move through this difficult area of terrain and then proceed on its attack on Shreveport. Now, the removal of the army from the range of the guns of the gunboats, even though troops were marching on land, they were pretty much always in range of the Union gunboats along the Red River, which, as I said, were a deciding factor. The two armies, the Union was larger, and the addition of naval gunfire support would have played a key role in any battle along the river. But when the Union forces swung out west a little bit to advance on Shreveport, that provided the Confederate General Taylor with an advantage, at least in the sense that he wouldn't have to worry about the guns of the Union gunboats, and he decided to take advantage of that moment to strike at the Union forces. The resulting advance of General Taylor and his concentration of forces at Shreveport, and then his advance on the Union troops, ended up in the Battle of Mansfield on April 8th, 1864, approximately 150 years ago. The battle, as I said, was the first major engagement. I mentioned the Battle of Fort de Russy, but the Confederates only had about 350 men in the fort. It was the first major engagement in the Confederate attempt to stop the Union drive on Shreveport, and as I've already said, would end up being a decisive Confederate victory. The battle is interesting in some ways in that it reflects, to a certain extent, the Battle of the Wilderness, which was about to be fought to the west or east, between Generals Lee and Meade. Engagement took place was a key impediment to the Union forces in their ability to fight off the Confederate attack. The battlefield is heavily forested, but there was an open clearing in the middle of the field, much like certain parts in the Battle of the Wilderness, where there were a few open fields where the majority of the actual fighting took place, and that is actually the same situation here in the Battle of Mansfield. Now, the Union forces formed up on a small hill along a road, and General Banks had decided to engage General Taylor and meet his attack. Taylor formed up his troops in an attempt to hit the Union head-on. Now, because this was a battle in many sense like a meeting engagement, the Union Army and the Confederate Army, for that part, were fairly spread out. You see a small force that you start with in this battle, and in real life, the Confederates only had a couple thousand troops. They had about 5,000 to 8,000 troops that partook in the battle. An interesting little tidbit, this battle included many veterans of the Battle of Vicksburg. When Vicksburg surrendered to General Grant in 1863, most of the troops were paroled. What that basically means is they sign a sheet of paper agreeing to no longer participate in the war, to not fight in the war, and they're allowed to essentially go on their way. So in many cases, prisoners were kept and put into prison camps in the north, several famous ones, one of them being in Chicago. The same thing happened in the South, where Union prisoners were famously sent to multiple prison camps, one of them being Andersonville. But in many cases, prisoners were paroled. Another good example of this was after the Battle of Harper's Ferry in 1862. General Jackson took the entire Union garrison there of 12,000 men prisoner. However, he was in a rush. The Union Army was fighting General Lee up at Antietam, and he needed to get his troops there quickly. The Confederates simply didn't have the manpower or time to imprison all 12,000 of these soldiers, so they paroled them. Essentially, soldiers would sign a sheet of paper saying the war is over for me, I won't go back, I won't fight, and it was left on their honor not to do so. Now, the reason I bring this up for this battle is it's estimated anywhere between 500 to 2,000 of the soldiers which took place in the Confederate force of about 9,000 men in that early part of the battle were actually paroled soldiers from the Battle of Vicksburg, so men who had promised not to fight any longer and who had been taken prisoner, but who ended up foregoing those vows and fighting again anyway. I think it would be interesting to see how many soldiers during the war actually violated their paroles, if you will, and joined back up, or in some cases I'm willing to bet they weren't even voluntarily joining back up. I wonder what the role of either the Union or the Confederate governments was in handling paroled soldiers. Did they honor those paroles? Did they say you don't need to fight again? Or did they quickly re-enlist them? I'm not quite sure, but I think it would be an interesting to look into and an interesting item to study. Certainly not something that you think about a whole lot when you think about the Civil War. But anyway, General Taylor decided it was time to attack, and the Union forces were spread out thin, much as the Confederate forces were. Again, in this sense, to me, it's much like the Battle of the Wilderness, where soldiers are marching down a roadway with limited area to deploy the troops, and both armies just kind of ran headlong into each other. The Union formed up a small line along the roadway, which you can kind of see throughout this battle. The Union position is that of a long, thin line along a roadway. And the Confederates formed up, as you saw there, in somewhat of a semi-horseshoe shape, and then attempted to come down on the Union forces. The initial Union assaults during the Battle of Mansfield the initial Confederate assaults at the Battle of Mansfield were repulsed. The Union actually did fairly well early in the battle to drive the Confederates back, and as the battle went on, the Union slowly became overwhelmed, being pushed back from position to position, but still managing to hold their ground. It's interesting that the battle is labeled as a decisive defeat, though, because despite their initial success in holding back the Confederate soldiers, the Union were losing more heavily, and there were points where Union forces were pushed back and overrun. In fact, by the end of the battle, there was a key moment toward the end of the battle, west of the main Confederate attack. So the main Confederate attack came up these roads, and the Union did a pretty good job of holding it off. But as I showed you earlier, those cavalry troops that I kind of had on one flank, that represented in real life where the Confederates actually broke through. The Confederates drove the Union soldiers back on the flank, and that caused a panic, much in the sense of Bull Run, in which the Union forces withdrew from the field of battle in a disorganized state. The Battle of Mansfield was a fairly bloody battle for the Trans-Mississippi region's concerns, not certainly by any stretch when you compare it to the meat grinders, which took place shortly thereafter in the Eastern Theater, or even many of the major Western engagements which were about to take place at the Battle of Atlanta, or the Atlanta Campaign. This took place in early 1864, as I said, so it was just prior to General Sherman's march on the city of Atlanta, and the campaigns and battles that were fought around there were bloodier than it. But it was still a respectably bloody battle, if you will. Union troops estimated to lose about 700 soldiers killed or wounded, but there was over 1,500 more captured, as well as the loss of more than 20 guns and over 100 wagons and 1,000 horses. So it was really the supplies, the wagons, and the captured soldiers that turned this battle from somewhat of a tactical defeat into more of a decisive defeat. The Confederacy, on the other hand, lost about 1,000 men. Lost more men than the Union, which isn't uncommon when a force is on the offensive during a battle. But the Union's loss of 1,500 soldiers, and as I said already, 20 cannon, which probably amounted to about 4 or 5 batteries of artillery, is what really turned this battle into a significant Union defeat. The Union forces were pushed into a retreat and would end up being engaged the following day. So the Union troops would withdraw to the south and would fight a battle again at Pleasant Hill, a slightly more favorable position for the Union soldiers. The Red River Campaign mod actually does cover the following day's battle as well, so it's not just a mod that covers the Battle of Mansfield Hill, it really covers the Battle of Mansfield. It really does cover pretty much the entire important aspect of the Red River Campaign, and given that it's free and it's put out by the developers, I highly recommend you checking it out. You do need to buy the stock version of Scourge of War Gettysburg, but if you do go ahead and do that, then you can go ahead and get this mod downloaded for free without buying any of the expansions. So it's hard to go wrong there. As you can see here, in my case, I have pushed the Union back from their first line. I believe where I'm at right now is the second line. It's hard to tell because the objective markers do disappear after you seize them, but you can see there the Union troops are in retreat. What happened historically is the Union formed up one division on line, it got overrun. The second division arrived, it got overrun. So despite the fact that overall numbers were fairly similar and the Confederates did lose heavier casualties, the Union troops were defeated largely in something along the lines of a defeat in detail. So that definitely is something fairly interesting to me, is that the Union soldiers really didn't fare well at all. So as you can see here, the Unions formed up another defensive line, as was historically accurate. They were pushed back from one line and would form up another. Basically, in this case, that's probably an entirely new Union division. The first Union division was thrown out of their positions, and while they were in disarray along the roadway and in this kind of clearing that you can kind of see here. So again, it's an interesting aspect and a very different fight to many. Not a meeting engagement truly, in that the armies didn't really stumble into each other, but in other ways it was certainly similar to a meeting engagement in the sense that one division would engage, the next division would be thrown in, the next division after that. What of a meat grinder, in that just unit after unit was thrown headlong into the engagement, and things break down rather rapidly when you have that kind of disorganized attack. But Taylor did well and ended up routing and severely damaging the Union Army, which lost nearly 20% of its own force, while the Confederates only lost about 10% of their force at Mansfield. They also gained valuable supplies from the Union wagon train, which was overrun, and made them even stronger perhaps after the battle than they were before. Not to mention confidence. Mansfield was a near utter disaster for the Union Army. Despite fighting well early in the battle, the Union forces collapsed and were demoralized into nearly an all-out rout. Banks was able to get his men in good order and to reform and fight what essentially became a holding action at Pleasant Hill the following day, which I am going to focus on here in my next video for this. As you can see, my attacks have gone fairly well. I've driven the Union back a couple of times. They're certainly out of their original positions into maybe their second or third line. I don't believe I'll have enough time here in this scenario to push them all the way off the map. They've done pretty well in disorganizing some of my attacks. So I'm holding this farmhouse, but you can see there they've got another defensive line beyond. Still, about half of their army has already been routed from the field, so the remaining Union line is going to be mainly more or less rear guard action. And I'm going to win the battle most likely in at least a minor victory, but as far as a major victory, well, that's probably something that we won't accomplish here today. We're more or less already victorious in this part of the field here, so we're going to fast forward it just a little bit so we can kind of get toward the end of the battle. This is a 90-minute long scenario. I've already pushed the Union back several times. I've got one more defensive line that I need to worry about, and I don't have a ton of time left in this scenario. We're more than halfway through, but and I am also somewhat spent. My initial forces are pretty exhausted and fought out just like the Union would be, so I'd be going up against a fresh line of infantry. But fortunately for me, the enemy troops likely are disorganized and exhausted from a long day's march getting into position. As I said, this is somewhat of a meeting engagement where both armies just kind of collided into each other and were not concentrated at the start and kind of concentrated in the middle of the fight. But anyway, that's enough of my rambling here. Let's jump forward just a little bit now that this area has been held, and my next move is going to be to launch an attack on this main center Union position here. They've got about 2 regiments in front of it, and then the main brigade or so, maybe division, behind it. So jumping forward, about 20 minutes ahead from where we were just a moment ago, I've got my forces in line here attacking the main Union brigade. I drove off the 2 regiments which were to my front over about 10 minutes, and then the following 10 minutes was spent getting my troops into position, which I now have them into position. Before I talk too much more about what's going on right now, that suffice to say the sort of history lesson, if you will, about the actual Battle of Mansfield is more or less over. I have received some reinforcements, as historically happened for both the Union and the Confederates. there were reinforcements which came in toward the tail end of the battle, and you can see those guys on the field now. If you will recall, just a few seconds ago, my troops were largely spent, somewhat fought out, and I got an additional corps on the field, about 7,000–8,000 more men, that should help me press the fight and push the Union back even further, turning what's been a fairly strong victory in my hands into more of a rout or a major defeat for the Union. As you can probably tell in my videos, I don't do a whole lot of editing. I'll throw in a few transitions here and there when I cut things out, but in general I'm just kind of scrolling around the map. As you see, I take the trees out there, and I don't do a whole lot of fine-tuning. It's something I'd like to work on, but thus far I haven't really done that. Anyway, so you can see here I'm attacking the Union position. We're heavily engaged. We've got troops coming down there. You can see on the enemy left flank, our right, kind of almost in their rear, which should really help push them back. In addition to these fresh 8,000 or so troops, I now have a substantial numerical superiority on the firing line, given the fact that the Union has about... Well, I am just kind of guessing at this point, but I believe they've only got about 6,000 troops left, probably combat effectives. I know historically the firing line had about 6,000 troops on that first line, which I pushed back. The second line is another division, which I believe about another 6,000. There were about a total of 14,000 troops that would be in the area of the engagement. You can hear for the Confederates, looks like about 13,000 if you add my casualties on with my men, and the Union historically had about 12,000 men engaged in the battle. So that would leave, if the first unit was routed, it would leave about 6,000 left. But you can see there off to the right, you've got two of my regiments into the rear of the Union Army. So I don't expect this line to hold out long. And once these guys get pushed back, all they'll have is a few artillery batteries, and then that next defensive line will be mine and should more or less seal a victory. Maybe not a major one, or I don't think I moved quick enough to get a major victory, but one that pertains to historical what really happened. And there you can see there on that right side the Federal regiment withdrawing. I've got two more regiments advancing on the Union flank, so this line should be rolled up in pretty short order. We're going to skip ahead a little bit here, and now that we're pretty certain we're going to win this battle, or this position anyway, we'll skip ahead a little bit. One thing I do want to point out, though, while we're looking at this here, is the flags in the game. There's some of these flags are custom flags that are part of this mod that were put together, so you'll see a little bit more variety, especially on the Confederate side, in the Red River campaign flag, or in the Red River campaign mod, with some additional unit flags that weren't part of the stock game, because of some of the units having some rather unique looking flags in this this historical campaign. But we'll go ahead and jump forward a little bit here now that we've got some regiments. It looks like one of my guys retreated, but they're reforming, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But we've got another regiment you can see there moving directly into the rear of the Union regiments, and this line is not going to hold long. We're going to roll up the Union positions and push them back and win this one pretty. This defensive position will be won pretty decisively. The battle will probably, as I said, be a moderate victory. So jumping ahead here now about 6 minutes. You'll see we're attacking some artillery batteries, but we've now got that defensive position pretty well held locked up. All the Union regiments have been thrown back. I did have trees off earlier, so just mentioning it, the field wasn't as open as it looked. It was just merely for the ability to see where my guys were. The trees in the game are really gorgeous in my opinion, but it does sometimes get in the way of you know, kind of seeing where you're at. Looks like they've got about one more regiment, but that one's really kind of cut off and might even be forced to surrender here. So looks like we're going to win a victory. It's not going to be a decisive victory. It's probably going to be about in line with what historically happened. The Union did set up a rear guard action, and while several of the regiments panicked and ran, and the Confederates did capture a large number of Union supply wagons, they didn't totally destroy the army, and there was a rear guard that was formed. You can kind of see down the road there another one of those eagle symbols representing another objective as I turn the trees back on here. indicating there is one more defensive position that I have to take and hold to win a decisive victory, but with only about 10, 12 minutes left, I don't have the time to attack another position and take it. So pretty close result to what happened historically, and yeah, so we've won the battle, and we just haven't won it as decisively as we could have. But there's only about 12, maybe 16 minutes left, and I've got another 8 minutes that I have to hold the objective. So again, just no time to finish off the battle. The game does have a time acceleration feature, which allows you to put the game into times 2 times, so I'll probably do that here in a moment, and just kind of finish driving off these artillery pieces and enjoying my victory here. But that's going to do it here. I've taken, looks like about 4,000 casualties, so about 4 times what historically happened in the battle. Union's taken a little bit less than that, but they're just as disheveled as they were historically, almost certainly. And again, a victory for the Confederacy, and I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead to the end here, and that's going to wrap this video up. So I do appreciate you tuning in. This is again the Historical Gamer for the wargamer.com. This is the first part in my Red River campaign series, which I'm going to be looking at. The next video is going to be focusing on the Battle of Pleasant Hill, I believe it's called, the battle which took place on April 9th, so again about 150 years ago. There were a few further battles, I believe. I need to do a little bit more research on it, that were fought in May, which I'm going to be covering as well. I'm going to try and get those out for the 150th anniversary dates, but we'll see how things fall. I haven't made a video in a while because I'm just in the process of moving, so real life getting in the way of doing some of these things, but hey, it happens for everyone, right? But anyway, as we see here, we're accelerating here toward the end, and that should just about do it. There you see, enemy lost about 4,000 casualties, we lost about 4,600, so Union lost about 1,800 more than they did historically. We lost 3,600 more than historically, but we still won a victory there. It was a minor victory, again, pretty in line with what happened. And again, I appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to, you know, all the good stuff, like, favorite, subscribe, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day, whatever day you may be watching this. But until next time, this is the Historical Gamer, signing out.